Let me paint a picture for you. I'm driving home from work. I park up, get inside, take off my shoes, drop off my backpack, and I grab my iPad to sit down so I can start working on something. But then I realized it would be easier if I just did this on a MacBook. Does this ever happen to you? And yes, this is my dilemma, so let me explain.
And we call it the iPad.
The iPad came out when I was about 13 years old, and from the moment I saw it in person, I was amazed with it, and I just thought that that was going to be the future of computers. I spent the whole next year saving up, and when the iPad 2 came out, I finally had enough to buy my first iPad. When I started using it, I started to see what the potential could be. And in my head, I had this vision of what the iPad was eventually going to become. And I was really thinking that it was going to replace pen and paper and probably the computer as well. Now, if you fast forward to the iPad Pro models, Apple started to play into this, and the idea of the iPad being like a laptop replacement started becoming more of a reality. When I first started making videos on this channel about the iPad, it was a critical tool that I was using constantly. I was taking notes on it during school, I was studying and doing homework on it, and it was vital for me to kind of succeed in school. But now that I've graduated, I use it in a different way. I still use it for notes whenever I take notes, but it's just not that common. Now, when I really started to question whether the iPad was still a tool that I should use is when I was in Japan last year, and I was just trying to dump a whole bunch of photos off my SD cards from my camera onto an SSD. And the only device I brought was the iPad because it was thin, light, and small, and very easy to carry around in my camera bag. Now, when I tell you I struggled to use the iPad for file transfers, it was horrible. I basically did not think I was going to get anything over. And just to put some perspective on how much data I was trying to push through, in a matter of 14 days, I think I took over 700 gigabytes worth of photos and videos. Now, every time I tried transferring files and it was like a big slug of files, the iPad just crashed completely. The Files app just crashed and it would freeze, and I would have to unplug and replug the camera or the SSD hub and everything like that. And it just wasn't having it. Luckily, one of the friends I was with did bring his MacBook, and I was able to use that to transfer all the files. And granted, that still struggled a little bit too with how much I was trying to transfer over, but it actually pulled through in the end, which the iPad did not. Now, up until this moment, I never really had any like high stakes type of environment that I was in where it was kind of a make or break situation with the iPad. But because of this, I now started thinking about the iPad a little bit differently, and in the back of my head, this scenario has just kind of always been there. So I guess if it wasn't clear, one thing that I'm trying to decide is whether or not I should just give up on the iPad altogether and just get a MacBook. There are a couple of different areas aside from file transfers that have also been playing a role in this dilemma that I've had, and one of them is battery life. Obviously, with a smaller device, you're not going to be able to fit as much battery, so and with the kind of improvements Apple has made, the MacBook battery life has been way better than I think an iPad would be. And also with a single port, if you're charging, you don't have that port available to you, and then you kind of end up with the situation where you always have to carry a dongle with you. Not to mention, the new iPad is incredibly slim. If they had kept the same thickness and put in, a bigger battery, I think the battery life on the iPads would have been way better, but I mean, I don't know that for sure, I guess. Another area is efficiency. When you're trying to do tasks, sometimes on the iPad are just a little bit harder to do, and there's these hurdles you have to kind of overcome just to be able to use this as your main computer or your main device. And I think that just kind of maybe hinders the potential of what you can do in a certain amount of time. I did see one YouTuber, I forgot who it was, and I'll try to link that video down in the description, but they were using the iPad, and they were saying that using the iPad as like their main computer just kind of helped them focus, and I think that maybe kind of comes down to the limits you get with the iPad. But there's definitely some things, like when you're trying to open up a specific website where there's an app also on the iPad, sometimes it just forces you to go to the app even if you want to stay in Safari, and you kind of just have to keep opening those websites in a new tab in order to not be redirected to the app. Now, efficiency also kind of leads us to multitasking, and if you try to do multiple things at once on the iPad, you can do it, but it's just not the same as on a computer. And Apple's tried to make some improvements, like adding Stage Manager, which I honestly don't like. Every time I turn it on, I end up turning it off. And I don't know if the smaller iPad Air 5 screen size is kind of playing a role in that, and maybe a 13-inch would, I guess a little bit easier to multitask and use Stage Manager, but every time I've turned it on, I turn it off not too long after because I just don't like it. Now, when it comes to apps, the iPad has obviously done a really good job with getting iPad supported apps and even some more pro level apps coming over to the iPad like Affinity Photo, Photoshop, and DaVinci Resolve. But something that I've also noticed is sometimes in some of these apps on the iPad, you get a little bit more of a limited experience, or you get just a different set of features that kind of interferes with your workflow. And one really good example of this is, I guess, Final Cut Pro, because there's a lot that's similar. There's some new features that are iPad specific, but then also there's some features that you just don't get that you would normally get on the full desktop version of Final Cut Pro. And at the end of the day, when it comes down to what value you get out of an iPad, when you look at the price points of a MacBook and an iPad, they're starting to get really close together, especially if we're talking about the iPad Pro specifically. And just to kind of, I guess, put it into perspective, if you were to get the iPad Pro, the 13-inch model with the base storage, that is $12.99. Then you'd want to get a keyboard, and that's an extra $3.49. And then on top of that, you would need to get a new Apple Pencil because you can't use the old Apple Pencils, and that'll be $129. And then that'll bring up your total. And then if you were to get a MacBook Air and do some upgrades, so let's say you get the 15-inch size, you get 16 gigabytes of RAM, 512 gigabytes of storage, and that'll be $16.99. Now, obviously, you're not going to get the tandem OLED, but just to kind of put things into perspective, that's where kind of the iPad lands. Arguably, you'll get a better value out of that MacBook Air. Now, if I were to get a MacBook, I would get a M1 Pro refurbished MacBook Pro 16-inch, and there's a couple of different places you can get it. I guess we'll just kind of see what happens there. Although I pretty much spent most of this video, I guess, bashing the iPad, I still really like the iPad, and I really think that depending on what you use a laptop for, it definitely can replace a laptop for you. But there are just some of those things that at the end of the day would be a lot more efficient and easier to do on a laptop. And at the end of the day, I do think that the iPad still can be the future of mobile computing, but whether or not that will become the future is up to Apple.